So today we are going to talk about mummies. Now, I know what you're thinking, West Virginian, what do mummies have to do with West Virginia history? Probably more than you think. Today we are going down to Philippi, West Virginia to talk about the Philippi Mummies. If you've ever found yourself awake at 4:30 in the morning because you started researching mummies at 10 p.m. go ahead and hit that subscribe button. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm the Best Virginian. I bring you West Virginia history and travel videos from across the great mountain state of West Virginia, and today we are heading down to Philippi in Barbour County, West Virginia. Philippi is known for several things. It's home of the Philippi Covered Bridge, which is one of the longest covered bridges that are still part of a United States highway system. It was home to one of the first land skirmishes of the American Civil War, and it was also the hometown of one Ted Cassidy, the actor most well known for portraying Lurch in the original Addams Family. In fact, I went down there recently for their annual Lurch Fest, a festival dedicated to Ted Cassidy. Now, while down there, I went to the Philippi Museum and got to see the Philippi Mummies. So the story of the Philippi Mummies, really goes back centuries. People for very long time have been trying to figure out ways to preserve human bodies. Probably the most well-known would be the Egyptian mummies, but there are other various types of mummies that have basically been found all over the world. But really, the origin of the Philippi mummies goes back to roughly the beginning of the American Civil War. During the 1840s, the process of modern embalming was kind of invented. At the time, there were many soldiers who were killed on the battlefield and had to be transported hundreds of miles back home, and really without any type of chemical preservatives, they just couldn't make the trip, or the condition they would be in once they got back home was far less than satisfactory. And so therefore, during the American Civil War, embalming became a much more common practice. Enter one Graham Hamrick, a Philippi salesman, farmer, inventor, and undertaker. While the process of preserving bodies had made great leaps in improvement over the previous 30 years, Graham wasn't satisfied with the current practices and believed he could do them even better. Why just preserve a body temporarily long enough to bury it when you could preserve a body for thousands of years, just like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt? Now, Graham was a very religious individual, and he believed that the Old Testament of the Bible actually had instructions in it for how to mummify human bodies and preserve both food and drinks. According to local legend, the first thing he preserved was a glass of milk that stayed good for over a year. I don't know if he drank it or not, but some of the things he would go on to do, that would make sense that he just at one point consumed copious amounts of deadly chemicals, because this is where the story starts to get really, really weird. Also, take everything after this point with a little bit of salt, because it seems like history and local folklore have really kind of intermingled to add a lot to this already weird story. He would then go on to use this process that involved this weird homemade concoction, this formula to preserve fruit, vegetables, eventually small animals, and possibly even a human head. Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of stray cats in Philippi during this time period. There might have also been an infant that he mummified. Now, when he had decided that he was ready to mummify a full human body, he went to the West Virginia State Hospital in Weston, West Virginia. At the time, there was a large stigma attached to mental health, so families would send individuals to the West Virginia State Hospital, and if they passed while there, a lot of the times families wouldn't want them back. They wouldn't want them back to bury, so in order to cut some of the cost to the taxpayers that it would cost to bury these bodies if someone, for scientific reasons or medical reasons, came to them and said, hey, we need some bodies. The state, if they were like 70% sure that the individuals weren't going to do anything illegal with the bodies, would just turn them over and not really ask too many questions on what they planned on doing with them. Which is how we ended up with mummies. So once Hamrick had procured a couple human bodies, he returned to Philippi and began the mummification process. Now, once these two mummies were done, they caught the attention of P.T. Barnum, and the mummies began traveling with the world-famous circus both throughout the United States and Europe. Now, while on tour with the circus, Hamrick's mummies would catch the attention of the Smithsonian, who offered to take the mummies and put them in the museum. But part of the deal was that they had to have more information on how the mummies were made. They had to get some insight on the mummification process, to which Graham just said that he refused to give his secret formula to anyone, and the Smithsonian apparently just said, okay, that's fine, and walked away. It wasn't until pretty close to the end of Hamrick's life that he would inform his family of the secret formula, and that after he passed, he wanted to be made into a mummy himself, to which his family just said, okay, fine, whatever. But as soon as he died, they went, yeah, we're not mummifying this guy, just put him in a hole somewhere. Like, we're not gonna mummify Graham. After many years of traveling with the circus, the mummies were eventually returned to the town of Philippi and were either kept in a barn or underneath someone's bed, depending on what version of the story you hear, until eventually the mummies were donated to the Barbour County Museum in Philippi. Remember when I said take everything said with a pinch of salt? That's because everything about the secret formula might have just been a story that was made up at some point, because Hamrick actually had this process patented. It's actually patent, U.S. Patent 466524A, pertaining to the preservation of human remains. The process involved exposing the body to sulfur fumes in a closed box for a short period of time. After that, the body would be drained of fluid and filled with a mixture of saltpeter and water. The body would then be suspended slightly higher in the box so that the sulfur fumes could fully encase, and sulfur would be added and burned to the box depending on how long you wanted the bodies to be preserved. For a short period of time, it would be basically a couple days. But for the case of the Philippi Mummies, it was sometime in between 30 and 57 days. Periodically, more saltpeter and water would be added to the body, along with more sulfur would be burned. So for those of you who are chemistry minded in my audience, they were combining sulfuric fumes, saltpeter, and the human body is already about 18.5% carbon, but that percentage goes up as moisture is drawn out of the human body. That is quite the combination of material. Now, he applied for this patent. It was approved, but expired in 1909, and the status of the patent is still expired. So if you want to go into the mummy making business, you can go into the mummy making business. Unfortunately, there's no mention in this patent of a secret preservation formula. Either that was purposely left out of the patent or it never existed. Once donated to the Barbour County Preservation Historical Society Museum, the mummies were regularly seen up until the flood of 1985. Yes, that flood of 1985. The Election Day floods. The killing floods. There's still parts of West Virginia that if you go to and say the flood, They know what you're talking about. That 1985 flood. And this is where some other stories vary. Some say the mummies ended up being heavily damaged in floodwater but stayed within the museum. There are some accounts that the mummies were actually washed away from the museum and found just in fields around this part of West Virginia. And that infant mummy that I mentioned earlier, there's varying accounts. Some say that it was lost and never seen again in the floodwaters. Others say that it was so heavily damaged that they gave it a proper burial. Again, little grain of salt. So how do you rescue a waterlogged mummy? Well, in this case, they basically just drug them out to the museum steps, let them dry out in the sun, and then a mortician was brought in to do some fine cleanup work because the mummies had started rapidly molding. Not making that one up. There's no grain of salt there. There are numerous newspaper reports about that's how they dealt with the mummies. Today, the mummies are on display, and if you find yourself in Philippi, West Virginia, you can visit them for only a $1 donation. The Barbour County Museum has a lot of other great exhibits. At some point, I'll do a video showcasing some of what they have. They have a lot of Civil War history, a lot of local World War history, an entire exhibit dedicated to Ted Cassidy. You can see the mummies for just $1. That's 50 cents per mummy. That's a really good deal. So I hope you learned something today. If you did, leave a like. As always, subscribe to the channel, and sharing these videos always help. But until next time, don't forget to stay wild, stay wonderful, and I'll talk to you later.